You're lucky we even let people like you serve us.
There are moments that change a person's life forever, and sometimes those moments begin with just a few cruel words. Without people like us, you'd have nothing. I hope your evening gets better, ma'am. It already will the moment you walk away. The laughter that followed echoed across the dining room. Conversations stopped. Every eye turned toward the young waitress standing quietly beside the table. Several guests lifted their phones, eager to capture another embarrassing moment. One person even whispered that she looked too calm for someone being humiliated in front of an entire restaurant. Then, without warning, the elegant woman picked up her crystal wine glass and slowly poured its deep red contents across the waitress's white apron. A few people gasped. Others laughed even harder. The waitress never raised her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply lowered her eyes for a moment and softly apologized for ruining their evening, even though everyone in the room knew she had done nothing wrong. Hidden in a quiet corner, an elderly gentleman watched every second of what had just happened. He finished his coffee, folded his napkin with remarkable care, and walked toward the exit. As he passed the shaken waitress, he paused just long enough to say, "Thank you for reminding me that character is always revealed when no one believes they are being judged." Then he disappeared into the night. By the following afternoon, the same couple who laughed at that waitress would discover that the future of the luxury hotel empire they were desperate to purchase rested entirely in her hands. If this is your first time joining us, before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Audrey Sterling, and until that evening, I believed I was nothing more than another waitress trying to make it through long shifts with a smile. I had spent nearly 3 years working at the Grand Crescent Hotel in downtown Chicago, arriving before sunrise, leaving long after dinner service ended, and learning that some guests treated kindness as a weakness they could exploit. Most of my coworkers wondered why I never complained, even after the difficult customers left. The truth was simple. My grandmother had raised me to believe that the way someone treats you says far less about your worth than it does about their own. I carried those words with me every single day, even when they were difficult to believe. What I didn't know was that my grandmother had left behind far more than advice. She had also left behind a secret that had remained hidden for years, protected by people I had never met and documents I had never seen. While I spent my days delivering meals and clearing tables, powerful executives, corporate lawyers, and wealthy investors were searching for one missing person without realizing she was serving coffee only a few feet away from them. The couple who humiliated me that evening were Charles and Victoria Harrington, names that appeared regularly in business magazines and society columns. To the public, they were celebrated as brilliant investors with an unmatched ability to transform struggling luxury properties into profitable destinations. Their interviews were polished, their charity galas attracted celebrities, and every acquisition seemed to make them even more admired. But behind those polished headlines, employees whispered about another side of the Harringtons. Hotels they purchased were often stripped of longtime staff within weeks. Retirement plans disappeared. Loyal managers were replaced by people willing to follow orders without asking questions. Entire communities watched historic hotels lose the warmth that had made them special. Now, they had set their sights on the Crown Legacy Hotel Collection, one of the oldest family-owned luxury brands in America. Every newspaper believed the deal would be finalized within days. Every executive expected the paperwork to be signed. Every investor was already celebrating. None of them knew that one signature was still missing. And that signature belonged to someone no one had ever thought to notice. Most people believe they can recognize wealth the moment they see it. They look for expensive watches, tailored suits, luxury cars, or the confidence that often comes with money. Very few ever stop to consider that real influence rarely needs to announce itself. Looking back now, I realize I spent years surrounded by people who judged my entire life by the uniform I wore. To them, I wasn't Audrey Sterling. I was simply the waitress. They never asked where I came from. They never wondered why I seemed content working double shifts without complaining. They certainly never imagined that my last name carried a history older than most of the buildings they admired. The irony still amazes me because while executives across the country hired investigators, attorneys, and financial experts to locate the mysterious shareholder standing between them and a billion-dollar acquisition, they brush past me every day without giving me a second glance. Sometimes the greatest disguise isn't a fake identity. Sometimes it's being completely overlooked. My life was simple, at least on the surface. I rented a modest apartment on the north side of Chicago, drove a 12-year-old sedan that rattled every time I started the engine, and kept a notebook where I carefully planned every expense before the month even began. After each shift, I visited Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, my 82-year-old neighbor who had become like family after I moved into the building. I helped carry her groceries, fixed anything around her apartment that needed repairing, and shared dinner with her whenever she insisted she had cooked too much food for one person. She often teased me that I spent more time taking care of everyone else than I did myself. I would laugh and tell her that kindness had never made anyone poor. She always smiled at that answer, though there were moments when she looked at me as if she knew something I didn't. There was one thing about my life that never made sense, no matter how many times I tried to explain it. On the first Monday of every month, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter containing only a few encouraging sentences and a cashier's check that covered almost exactly half of my rent. I had tried asking the bank where the checks came from, but they politely told me the information was confidential. I asked my grandmother about it before she passed away, and she simply squeezed my hand and said, "When the time comes, you'll understand why some promises must remain unspoken." That was the last conversation we ever had about it. After her funeral, the letters continued to arrive as if nothing had changed. Eventually, I stopped trying to solve the mystery. I simply accepted them with gratitude, believing they were one final act of love, arranged by someone who had cared deeply about my grandmother. The only thing I owned that truly connected me to her was an old silver pendant she had given me on my 21st birthday. It wasn't flashy or particularly valuable, at least as far as I knew, but she made me promise never to sell it and never to take it off. "This isn't jewelry," she had whispered while fastening it around my neck. "It's a reminder of who you are, especially on the days when the world tries to convince you that you're nobody." I thought she was speaking about confidence, about self-worth, about surviving difficult seasons with grace. I had no idea those words carried a much deeper meaning. Even after years had passed, I still reached for that pendant whenever life became overwhelming, never realizing that several people had spent decades searching for the woman wearing it. The morning after Charles and Victoria Harrington humiliated me, I walked into work expecting another ordinary shift. I assumed the videos recorded in the restaurant would disappear into the endless stream of moments people posted online every day. I certainly didn't expect anyone important to remember my face. But as I tied my apron and greeted my coworkers, I noticed something unusual. Our general manager, a man who rarely left his office before noon, was standing in the lobby watching me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sympathy. It looked more like disbelief. The moment our eyes met, he quickly looked away and disappeared into his office without saying a word. I shrugged it off and continued preparing for breakfast service, unaware that upstairs, behind a locked conference room door, several members of the hotel's executive board had just received a phone call that would bring every negotiation, every celebration, and every carefully crafted plan to a complete stop. I didn't know it then, but everything changed less than an hour after I clocked in that morning. The breakfast rush had barely begun when my manager stepped onto the restaurant floor and called my name. His voice was unusually formal, almost cautious, as if he had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but still wasn't sure how to say it. "Audrey, when you finish serving table 12, I'd like you to come to my office." I nodded, without asking questions. My first thought was that the Harringtons had filed a complaint after the incident the night before. It wouldn't have surprised me. Wealthy guests often believed money gave them the right to rewrite the truth, and businesses rarely challenged people who spent millions of dollars. As I poured coffee for another guest, I quietly prepared myself for a warning, a suspension, or perhaps even losing the job I had worked so hard to keep. When I entered my manager's office, I immediately noticed I wasn't alone. Two men in dark business suits were sitting across from his desk. They looked more like attorneys than hotel executives, and the leather briefcases resting beside their chairs only reinforced that impression. The moment I walked in, both men stood to greet me. That alone felt strange. Important people rarely stood up for a waitress. One of them smiled politely before asking a question that caught me completely off guard. "Miss Sterling, we'd like to know if you've ever met a gentleman named William Ashcroft." I searched my memory but couldn't place the name. I apologized and told them I had never heard it before. The two men exchanged a quick glance before one of them closed a folder without another word. They thanked me for my time, apologized for interrupting my shift, and left as quietly as they had arrived. I looked at my manager, hoping he would explain what had just happened, but he only shook his head and admitted he was just as confused as I was. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't stop thinking about that name, William Ashcroft. It sounded familiar in a way I couldn't explain, like hearing the title of a book you knew someone had once read to you as a child. Every time I tried to remember where I had heard it, the memory slipped away before I could grasp it. Around lunchtime, I called the only person who might have known the answer, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks answered after the second ring. Before I could even finish asking whether my grandmother had ever mentioned someone by that name, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her normally cheerful voice had grown unusually serious. "Audrey," she said quietly, "if someone is asking about William Ashcroft, then something has happened. Promise me you'll come see me after work. There are things I've kept from you because I promised your grandmother I would wait until the right time." My heart began racing. I wanted answers immediately, but before I could ask another question, she gently ended the call by saying, "Just come. Everything will make sense soon." The afternoon became even stranger. News spread through the hotel that Charles and Victoria Harrington had arrived unexpectedly for a private meeting with the executive board. Their acquisition was supposedly only days away from being finalized, yet the atmosphere inside the building felt nothing like a celebration. Executives hurried through the hallways, carrying stacks of documents. Lawyers moved from office to office with anxious expressions. Conversations stopped whenever employees walked by. Even guests noticed that something unusual was happening behind closed doors. As I cleared a table near one of the conference rooms, I overheard a frustrated voice from inside. It was Charles Harrington. "I don't care who this missing shareholder is," he snapped. "Find them before the board meeting tomorrow. If that signature doesn't appear, this entire deal falls apart." I froze for just a second before continuing my work, completely unaware that the person he was desperately searching for had been standing only a few feet away, carrying his coffee tray with both hands. I spent the rest of my shift trying to convince myself that everything happening around me was just a coincidence. Strange questions from unfamiliar attorneys, an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Brooks, executives rushing through the hotel like they were trying to put out a fire, and Charles Harrington demanding that someone find a missing shareholder It all felt too disconnected to have anything to do with me. By the time I clocked out that evening, I had almost succeeded in pushing those thoughts aside. I grabbed my purse, changed out of my uniform, and drove straight to Mrs. Brooks's apartment. The moment she opened the door, I knew this wasn't going to be another one of our ordinary visits. Her smile was gone. Sitting on the coffee table between us was an old wooden box I had never seen before. It looked worn with age, its brass corners faded from decades of careful handling. Before I could ask about it, she gently placed her hand over mine. "Your grandmother asked me to keep this hidden until the day someone came looking for William Ashcroft," she said softly. I prayed that day would never come, but I knew it eventually would. My heart pounded as she lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly organized documents, several faded photographs, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. I expected a simple letter, maybe another piece of family history I had never heard before. Instead, the first sentence stopped me cold. If you are reading this, Audrey, it means the people I spent my life protecting you from have finally found their way back. I read the line over and over, unable to understand what she meant. Protecting me from whom? My grandmother had always described our family as ordinary people who worked hard and stayed out of trouble. Nothing about my childhood suggested otherwise. Mrs. Brooks quietly watched my face as I continued reading, waiting until I reached the bottom of the first page before she spoke again. Everything you believed about your family was only part of the truth. She picked up one of the photographs and handed it to me. It showed my grandmother standing beside a distinguished older gentleman outside a magnificent hotel that looked more like a European palace than an American business. Behind them hung a large sign that read, "Sterling Grand Hotels, Est, 1958. I stared at the picture, then back at Mrs. Brooks. "I've never seen this before," I whispered. She nodded slowly. "Because your grandmother never wanted you to. The man standing beside her is William Ashcroft. He wasn't just her business partner. He was her closest friend, and together they built one of the most respected luxury hotel companies in the country. But when powerful investors began circling the business, they made a decision that almost no one understood. They erased every public connection between your family and the company. They believed that if no one knew an heir existed, no one could manipulate or threaten that heir. I felt as though the room had begun spinning around me. Every answer seemed to create an even bigger question. Mrs. Brooks reached into the box one last time and removed a small leather folder that had yellowed with age. "Your grandmother told me never to show you this unless I was absolutely certain the time had come." Inside was a copy of a trust agreement bearing my grandmother's signature and William Ashcroft's signature side by side. Halfway down the page, one line had been highlighted decades earlier. I read it silently, then read it again because I couldn't believe my eyes. It stated that the controlling ownership of Sterling Grand Hotels would pass to the last living descendant of Eleanor Sterling only after that person had completed a period of anonymous service within the company, demonstrating integrity, humility, and compassion without knowledge of the inheritance. I looked up at Mrs. Brooks, completely speechless. She smiled sadly and nodded. "Audrey, you were never hired by accident. Someone has been watching over you since the day you filled out that application. Every act of kindness, every difficult guest you treated with respect, every moment you chose grace instead of anger, it was all being recorded. And after what happened with the Harringtons last night, the people overseeing your grandmother's wishes finally reached their decision." Before I could ask another question, my phone suddenly rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered hesitantly, and a calm voice introduced himself as James Holloway, legal counsel for the Sterling Family Trust. "Miss Sterling," he said, "I apologize for contacting you so late, but it's important that we meet first thing tomorrow morning. There are people who will do almost anything to prevent what is about to happen, and after tonight, we can no longer assume you're safe." The call ended before I could respond. I sat there staring at the phone, my grandmother's letter still resting in my lap, while one terrifying realization settled over me. Charles and Victoria Harrington believed they were searching for a missing signature. They had no idea they had already met the person who could either hand them the hotel empire they wanted or make sure they never owned a single room. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my grandmother's words repeating in my mind, followed by the image of Victoria Harrington smiling as she poured wine across my uniform. None of it made sense. If everything Mrs. Brooks had shown me was true, why had no one ever told me? Why would my own grandmother allow me to grow up believing we were just an ordinary family? More importantly, why would anyone require me to work as a waitress without knowing who I really was? By sunrise, I had accepted one thing. Whatever answers I had been searching for all my life were finally within reach. I just didn't know whether discovering the truth would change my future for the better or destroy the peaceful life I had always known. At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, I arrived at the address James Holloway had given me. It wasn't a law office like I expected. It was an elegant stone building overlooking Lake Michigan, with no company logo anywhere outside. A receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself and escorted me into a private conference room. Waiting inside were James Holloway and the elderly gentleman who had quietly watched everything unfold in the restaurant 2 nights earlier. The moment I saw him, I recognized the calm expression that had stayed with me ever since he thanked me for revealing people's true character. Before I could ask how he knew me, he stood and offered his hand. "My name is William Ashcroft," he said with a gentle smile. "I've been waiting a very long time to meet you properly." For several seconds, I couldn't say a word. This was the same man the attorneys had asked about, the same man whose name had unlocked the box my grandmother left behind. William invited me to sit before sliding a thin folder across the table. Inside were copies of employee evaluations from the past 3 years, every annual review, every customer compliment, every note praising my honesty. There were even reports describing moments I had completely forgotten, like staying after my shift to help a housekeeper finish cleaning rooms after another employee became sick. I looked up in disbelief. William nodded. "You believed no one noticed those moments because you weren't doing them for recognition. That's exactly why they mattered. Your grandmother believed a person should never inherit great responsibility until they proved they would choose kindness when no reward was expected." Then James opened another folder, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. This one contained photographs of Charles and Victoria Harrington, newspaper articles about previous acquisitions, and financial records covered with handwritten notes. James looked directly at me before speaking. "The Harringtons believe they're purchasing Sterling Grand Hotels tomorrow afternoon. They have already convinced several board members that the transaction is inevitable. What they don't know is that the controlling shares have never belonged to the board. They've been held in trust, waiting for the rightful heir to complete the conditions your grandmother established years ago." He paused, just long enough for me to absorb the weight of his words. "Yesterday morning, after reviewing the final reports, Mr. Ashcroft signed the last document, confirming that you fulfilled every condition of the trust. As of tomorrow's board meeting, the company becomes yours." I stared at the folder without moving. It didn't feel exciting. It felt overwhelming. "There has to be someone more qualified," I finally said. "I've never run a hotel. I don't know the first thing about leading a company this size." William smiled the same patient smile my grandmother used whenever I doubted myself. "Running a business can be taught," he replied. "Integrity cannot. We've watched brilliant executives destroy companies because they cared only about profits. Your grandmother wanted someone who understood people before understanding balance sheets. She believed everything else could be learned. His confidence in me felt almost impossible to accept. Yet deep inside, I knew he wasn't trying to flatter me. He was honoring a promise he had made decades earlier. Before our meeting ended, James handed me one final document. It was the official agenda for the following afternoon's board meeting. Charles and Victoria Harrington were scheduled to present their final acquisition proposal at exactly 2 o'clock. The last item on the agenda simply read, "Recognition of the successor trustee." I frowned, unsure what it meant. James closed the folder and smiled. The Harringtons think tomorrow will be the day they celebrate the biggest victory of their careers. They have no idea they're about to walk into a room where every assumption they've made is about to collapse. My only advice is this, Audrey. When that moment comes, don't let anger make your decision. Let character do what money never could. As I left the building, I looked across the city skyline and took a long breath. For the first time since all of this began, I realized the hardest part wasn't discovering who I was. The hardest part would be deciding what kind of owner I wanted to become when the entire world was finally watching. When I arrived at the Grand Crescent Hotel that afternoon, it felt as though I had stepped into a completely different world. The same marble floors, the same crystal chandeliers, and the same smiling employees were all there. Yet something had changed. People were speaking in hushed voices. Executives, who usually walked confidently through the lobby, now looked distracted, constantly checking their phones. Even the security staff seemed unusually alert. It didn't take long to understand why. Every member of the executive board had arrived hours ahead of schedule, and Charles and Victoria Harrington had practically taken over the top floor while preparing for what they believed would be the most important meeting of their lives. I tried my best to focus on my work, reminding myself that, for a few more hours at least, I was still just another waitress. As I carried lunch into one of the private meeting rooms, I heard Charles speaking confidently to several investors. "By this time tomorrow," he said with a smile, "Sterling Grand Hotels will belong to us. Once we restructure the company, we'll close the underperforming locations, replace senior management, and reduce labor costs across every property. Sentiment doesn't build profitable businesses, discipline does." A few people around the table nodded in agreement, while others laughed quietly. They spoke about thousands of employees as though they were numbers on a spreadsheet, instead of people with families, mortgages, and dreams. I lowered my eyes, served the coffee, and walked out without saying a word. None of them recognized me from the restaurant. To them, I was invisible once again. As I reached the hallway, someone quietly called my name. I turned to find William Ashcroft standing near one of the windows overlooking the city. He had entered through a private elevator, unnoticed by everyone else. "Walk with me," he said. We slowly made our way through one of the quieter corridors of the hotel. "There's something your grandmother wanted you to understand before tomorrow." I listened carefully as he continued. "Many people think this company was built on luxury. It wasn't. It was built on trust. Your grandmother believed guests would always remember how they were treated long after they forgot the thread count of the sheets or the price of the rooms. She expected every owner after her to protect that philosophy, even when it was expensive to do so." He stopped walking and looked directly at me. "Tomorrow isn't simply about inheriting a business. It's about deciding whether those values survive." His words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. As my shift came to an end, I returned to the employee locker room to change out of my uniform. Waiting on the bench was a neatly wrapped garment bag with my name attached. There was no note, only a small card that read, "For tomorrow." Curious, I carefully unzipped the bag and found an elegant navy blue business suit, tailored so perfectly it looked as though it had been made specifically for me. Tucked into one of the pockets was a small velvet box. Inside rested a simple gold lapel pin bearing the original Sterling Grand Hotel's crest. the same crest I had seen in my grandmother's old photograph. I gently held it in my hand, and for the first time since learning the truth, everything began to feel real. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be putting on a waitress's apron. I would be walking into a boardroom carrying the legacy my grandmother had spent her entire life protecting. That evening, however, Charles and Victoria Harrington received news that changed their mood entirely. One of the private investigators they had hired finally returned with an update on the mysterious shareholder who had delayed the acquisition. According to his report, every corporate record had reached a dead end. There were no recent financial transactions, no public appearances, and no reliable photographs. Frustrated, Victoria slammed the report onto the conference table. "People don't simply disappear," she snapped. Charles remained unusually quiet before asking a question that caught everyone in the room off guard. What if we've been looking in the wrong places? What if the person isn't hiding from us? What if they're already inside this hotel? The room fell silent. For the first time since this deal began, uncertainty replaced confidence. They ordered additional security, instructed their staff to verify every employee working in the building, and demanded background checks on anyone who had access to the boardroom. They were only hours away from discovering the truth. Yet, they still couldn't imagine that the woman carrying trays through the restaurant every day was the very person they had spent millions of dollars trying to find. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror holding my waitress uniform in one hand and the navy blue suit in the other. For a long moment, I simply stared at both of them. One represented the life I thought I was meant to live. The other represented a future I never asked for, but could no longer avoid. Before leaving my apartment, I picked up my grandmother's silver pendant and held it tightly. "I wish you were here," I whispered, "because I have no idea what I'm doing." For just a second, I almost convinced myself to call James Holloway and tell him he had chosen the wrong person. I was comfortable serving guests. I knew how to calm upset customers, how to encourage exhausted coworkers, and how to solve small problems before they became big ones. Leading one of the country's most respected hotel companies was something entirely different. But then I remembered Charles Harrington's voice talking about thousands of employees as if they were nothing more than expenses. That memory alone was enough to make me walk out the door. When I arrived at Sterling Grand's corporate headquarters, several black luxury cars were already parked outside. Television reporters had gathered near the entrance after hearing rumors that the acquisition would finally be completed that afternoon. Investors, consultants, and legal teams filled the lobby, each convinced they were about to witness another Harrington victory. I kept my head down and walked toward the private elevator James had instructed me to use. Almost no one paid attention to me until I heard a familiar voice behind me. Well, this is unexpected. I turned slowly and found myself face to face with Victoria Harrington. She looked me up and down before letting out a short laugh. "I almost didn't recognize you without the apron." Charles joined her a moment later, smiling with the same confidence he had carried ever since this deal began. "Trying to reinvent yourself?" he asked. "If you're here hoping to impress someone, I'd save yourself the embarrassment. These meetings are reserved for people who actually matter." For a brief moment, I considered telling them everything. I imagined the look on their faces if I simply smiled and introduced myself as Audrey Sterling. But William's advice echoed in my mind. Don't let anger make your decision. Let character do what money never could. Instead, I calmly answered, "I hope your meeting goes well." Victoria smirked. "It will. By the end of today, this company will belong to us." She stepped aside, allowing Charles to press the elevator button. As the doors opened, he gestured toward the crowded lobby behind us. You should stay close. You might learn what success looks like." Neither of them noticed the quiet smile on James Holloway's face as he emerged from another hallway and watched the entire exchange without saying a word. The boardroom was unlike anything I had ever seen. A long, polished table stretched across the room beneath portraits of every previous leader of Sterling Grand Hotels. At the head of the table stood one empty chair, noticeably different from all the others. It wasn't larger or more elaborate, but it carried an unmistakable sense of history. James quietly leaned toward me and whispered, "That chair has remained empty since your grandmother stepped away from the company. No one has occupied it since." My stomach tightened. I wasn't ready for any of this. William Ashcroft entered moments later, greeting the directors with calm confidence. Every member of the board immediately rose to shake his hand. Charles and Victoria exchanged satisfied glances, assuming William's arrival meant the final approval of their acquisition. They couldn't have looked more certain that victory was only minutes away. The meeting began exactly at 2 o'clock. One by one, financial presentations filled the room. Charles confidently explained how his company would increase profits, eliminate unnecessary costs, and modernize the Sterling Grand brand. Victoria spoke about expanding into international markets and creating what she called a more efficient workforce. Every slide earned approving nods from investors seated near the back of the room. When they finished, Charles buttoned his jacket and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said proudly, "I believe we're ready to complete this transaction." A quiet murmur spread across the room as several attorneys reached for the acquisition documents. Then William Ashcroft slowly stood from his seat. He didn't look at Charles. He didn't look at Victoria. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Before any documents are signed," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room, "there is one final matter that must be resolved. The board cannot approve the sale until the rightful owner of Sterling Grand Hotels is formally recognized." Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward William. Charles frowned in confusion. Victoria folded her arms impatiently. Neither of them realized that, within the next few moments, the room they believed they controlled was about to become the place where everything they had spent years building would begin to slip through their fingers. For a few long seconds, no one in the boardroom moved. William Ashcroft remained standing at the head of the table while every eye followed his gaze until it landed on me. I could feel my heartbeat echoing in my ears as I slowly rose from my chair. Charles Harrington looked from William to me before letting out a short laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said. "She's one of the waitresses from the Grand Crescent." A few people around the table smiled uncertainly, assuming William was about to explain the mistake. Instead, he reached into a leather portfolio and removed a thick folder sealed with the Sterling family crest. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied calmly. "For more than 20 years, the Sterling Family Trust has protected the ownership of this company exactly as its founders intended. Today, we fulfill the final provision of that trust." An attorney stepped forward and carefully placed several original documents in front of each board member. William continued speaking without raising his voice. "Many of you believed the controlling shares were divided among investors. They were not. They have always been held by the Sterling Family Trust, awaiting the final heir." Charles immediately stood up. "Whoever that heir is should introduce themselves," he demanded. William gave a slight nod before turning toward me. "Miss Audrey Sterling, would you please join me?" Every sound inside the room disappeared. I could feel dozens of eyes fixed on me as I walked toward the front of the boardroom. With each step, memories flashed through my mind: the long shifts, the difficult customers, the countless moments I wondered whether my hard work would ever matter. I stopped beside William, still struggling to believe any of this was real. William opened the folder and began reading from the original trust agreement signed decades earlier. Upon completion of the required period of anonymous service, and upon confirmation of demonstrated integrity, humility, and compassionate leadership, the controlling ownership of Sterling Grand Hotels shall transfer immediately to the last living descendant of Eleanor Sterling. He paused briefly before smiling at me. That descendant is Audrey Sterling. One by one, every member of the board rose from their seats. It wasn't out of obligation. It was a gesture of respect that had been observed for every new steward of the company since its founding. I stood frozen, unsure how to respond. My eyes drifted toward the portraits, lining the walls until they rested on a photograph of my grandmother. For the first time, I understood why her portrait had always seemed different from the others. She hadn't simply worked for the company. She had helped build it. Victoria's expression changed from confidence to disbelief. "This is impossible," she said sharply. "She's never managed a business in her life." James Holloway calmly slid another folder across the table. "Neither did Eleanor Sterling when she inherited her first hotel," he replied. "Leadership has never been measured by titles alone." Charles refused to sit back down. "This entire process is absurd," he snapped. "We've spent months negotiating with your board." James looked directly at him. "You negotiated with people who manage the company. You never negotiated with the person who owns it." Those words landed with remarkable force. Several investors immediately began whispering among themselves as they realized the acquisition they had celebrated for weeks had never been guaranteed in the first place. Then William did something no one expected. Instead of asking me to sign documents immediately, he handed me the acquisition agreement Charles had prepared. "Miss Sterling," he said, "under the terms of the trust, the first decision belongs entirely to you. You may approve this sale exactly as written, renegotiate every condition, or reject it completely. No one in this room can make that choice except you." Charles finally looked at me, not as a waitress, but as the one person standing between him and everything he wanted. His confidence disappeared almost instantly. The same man who had mocked me only days earlier now spoke with careful restraint. "Audrey," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately. I'm sure we can reach an agreement that's beneficial for everyone." I looked down at the contract in my hands, remembering every word he had spoken about cutting jobs, replacing loyal employees, and treating people as numbers. Then I slowly closed the folder without signing a single page. "Before I make any decision," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time without hesitation, "there are a few questions I'd like answered." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had experienced since this extraordinary journey began, because everyone in that room understood one simple truth. The people who believed they held all the power were now waiting for permission to speak. I looked around the room before saying another word. Only 48 hours earlier, I had been standing in a restaurant, wearing a stained apron, while people laughed at me. Now, the same executives who had barely noticed my existence were waiting for my decision. It wasn't a feeling of victory that filled me. It was responsibility. My grandmother had spent her entire life protecting this company, not so it could become another trophy in someone's investment portfolio, but so it could remain a place where people were treated with dignity. If I forgot that now, then everything she had sacrificed would have meant nothing. I placed both hands on the conference table and looked directly at Charles Harrington. "When you presented your plans this morning," I began, "you spoke about increasing profits by eliminating positions across the company. Exactly how many employees were you planning to terminate?" Charles hesitated for the first time since the meeting had begun. His attorneys quietly exchanged nervous glances before one of them slid a document toward him. Charles cleared his throat before answering. "Approximately 1,400 positions over the first 18 months. A quiet murmur spread through the room. I nodded slowly before asking my second question. "And how many of those employees have worked for Sterling Grand Hotels for more than 20 years? This time, Charles didn't answer. Instead, one of his financial advisors reluctantly opened another report. "Just over 600, he admitted. I could see several board members lowering their heads. They hadn't been given those numbers before. "So," I continued calmly, "the people who spent decades building this company would have been the first to lose everything." Charles immediately tried to defend himself. It's business, Audrey. Difficult decisions are necessary if you want a company to grow. I remembered those exact words my grandmother used to challenge whenever she watched business interviews on television. She would smile sadly and say, "Anyone can make money by taking from others. The real test is creating success without destroying the people who helped you reach it." I slowly picked up the acquisition agreement and turned to the final signature page. Every camera in the room seemed focused on my hands. Investors leaned forward in their seats. Charles watched without blinking. Victoria folded her arms, trying to appear confident, but I noticed her fingers trembling slightly against her sleeve. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the document. Then, without saying a word, I closed the folder and handed it back to James Holloway. "I won't be signing this agreement." The silence that followed was almost overwhelming. Charles took one step forward. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly. "This acquisition would make you one of the wealthiest business owners in the country." I smiled politely. "No, Mr. Harrington. It would make me the person who sold my grandmother's life's work before I even understood what she built." Victoria finally lost her composure. "You're choosing sentiment over reality," she snapped. "You have no idea what it takes to run a company of this size." Before I could respond, William Ashcroft calmly stood beside me. "Actually," he said, "she already understands the most important part. She knows the names of the people who clean the rooms, prepare the meals, carry the luggage, and welcome every guest who walks through our doors. That knowledge cannot be purchased, and it certainly cannot be learned from quarterly profit reports." Several members of the board quietly nodded in agreement. One after another, directors who had remained silent throughout the meeting began speaking for the first time. They admitted they had privately questioned the Harrington proposal for months, but assumed they had no alternative. Now, for the first time, they did. Charles looked around the room and realized the momentum had shifted completely. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone. Investors who had arrived expecting to celebrate now whispered among themselves about withdrawing their support. One director requested an immediate review of the Harrington proposal. Another suggested reopening investigations into several of the couple's previous acquisitions after concerns about employee treatment were raised. Even the attorneys representing Charles and Victoria began quietly packing their files. The room that had once felt firmly under their control was slipping away with every passing minute. Then James Holloway placed one final folder in front of me. "There is one more matter requiring your approval," he said. I opened it and immediately recognized the restaurant security photographs from the night Victoria poured wine over my uniform. There were witness statements, employee reports, and dozens of messages from staff members describing years of disrespectful behavior by the Harringtons toward hotel employees across multiple properties. James looked at me before speaking quietly. "Your grandmother insisted that every owner protect the people who serve this company. Today, that responsibility becomes yours." I closed the folder and looked toward Charles and Victoria. Neither of them spoke. For the first time since I had met them, they weren't looking at a waitress. They were looking at the woman who now held the future of their entire business empire in her hands. I looked at the photographs one last time before closing the folder. There was the image of Victoria pouring wine over my uniform, another showing Charles laughing while guests recorded everything on their phones, and several witness statements from employees who had quietly endured similar treatment over the years. I could have made my decision based solely on what they had done to me, but that wasn't what concerned me most. I kept thinking about the hundreds of employees whose names I would never know, people who had probably gone home feeling invisible after being humiliated by individuals who believed wealth placed them above basic decency. My grandmother hadn't entrusted this company to me so I could settle personal scores. She had entrusted it to me to make sure no one working under the Sterling Grand name would ever have to question whether they deserved respect. I stood and slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking the city. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I turned back to the room. Mr. Harrington," I said calmly. "You told your investors that success requires difficult decisions. I agree. So here's mine." I placed the acquisition agreement on the table and gently pushed it back toward him. "Sterling Grand Hotels is no longer for sale." Charles closed his eyes for a brief second before taking a slow breath. "You're making this personal," he replied. I shook my head. "No, I'm making it permanent. If I sell this company to people who see employees as numbers, then every value my grandmother built this business on disappears the moment I sign that paper." Several directors quietly applauded. Others simply lowered their heads, knowing the decision had already been made. Victoria suddenly stood from her chair, unable to hide her frustration any longer. "You think you've won because someone handed you a title?" she said. "Running a company isn't about kindness, it's about power." I looked directly at her, remembering the restaurant, the laughter, and the wine soaking through my apron. "No, Mrs. Harrington," I answered quietly. "Power is making someone feel small because you believe they can't defend themselves. Leadership is making sure they never have to." The room became completely silent. Even the reporters who had been invited to cover the acquisition stopped writing for a moment. It was as though everyone understood that this meeting had become about far more than a business transaction. It had become a lesson in the kind of leadership money could never purchase. James Holloway then addressed the board. "With the owner's permission, there is one final report that should be entered into today's record." He nodded toward another attorney who connected a laptop to the large screen at the front of the room. To my surprise, the restaurant security footage from 2 nights earlier appeared before everyone. There was no dramatic editing, no commentary, just the simple truth. The room watched in complete silence as Victoria insulted me. Charles laughed, and the guests recorded everything on their phones. When the video ended, no one spoke for several long seconds. One of the oldest board members finally broke the silence. "If this is how they treat someone when they believe she has no power," he said quietly, "how have they treated employees across every company they've ever owned?" It was a question no one in the Harrington camp could answer. The consequences arrived almost immediately. 2 major investors requested a recess and quietly informed Charles they were withdrawing their financial support pending an independent review of his business practices. Another investor announced that his firm would no longer participate in the acquisition under any circumstances. One after another, the momentum Charles had spent years building began to disappear. His attorneys stopped arguing. His financial advisors gathered their files in silence. Victoria remained standing, but the confidence she had carried into the meeting was gone. She looked around the room, searching for someone willing to defend her, only to discover that every person who had applauded her presentation less than an hour earlier was now carefully avoiding eye contact. As everyone prepared to leave, I thought the meeting was finally over. Then William Ashcroft gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "Audrey," he said, "there is one last tradition your grandmother insisted every new owner observe." He handed me a small envelope that had remained sealed for years. Across the front, written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, were just 8 simple words: "Open only after your first decision as owner." My hands trembled as I carefully broke the seal. Whatever was inside had been waiting for this exact moment, and somehow I knew it wasn't another business document. It was my grandmother's final message to me, written years before she left this world, trusting that one day I would stand exactly where I was standing now. For a few moments, I simply held the letter in my hands. The room had almost emptied, yet no one seemed eager to leave. William remained beside me. James stood quietly near the end of the table, and several board members lingered as though they understood this letter was more than a personal message. It was the final piece of a story that had begun long before I was born. I unfolded the paper carefully, recognizing my grandmother's elegant handwriting immediately. The first sentence brought tears to my eyes before I had even reached the second line. "My dearest Audrey, if you're reading this, then you chose people over profit, and I could not be prouder of you. I had to stop for a moment. My grandmother had somehow known exactly what decision I would make, not because she could predict the future, but because she believed character revealed itself long before anyone was given power. I continued reading as quietly as I could. There will always be people who mistake kindness for weakness. Never waste your life trying to prove them wrong. Time will do that for you. The greatest leaders are not remembered because they own the tallest buildings or earn the largest fortunes. They are remembered because ordinary people slept peacefully at night, knowing someone honest was protecting what mattered most. I lowered the letter and closed my eyes. Suddenly, every lesson she had taught me as a little girl made sense. She had never been preparing me to become wealthy. She had been preparing me to become worthy. There was a difference, and I finally understood it. When I looked up again, William was smiling. "Your grandmother wrote that letter nearly 12 years ago," he said. "She revised her will many times, but she never changed a single word in that message." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. "She trusted me more than I ever trusted myself," I admitted. William nodded gently. "That's often how great mentors see us. They recognize our strength long before we do." Before either of us could say another word, James walked over carrying a tablet. His expression had changed. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but there's something you should see." He turned the screen toward me. It was a live news broadcast. The headline stretched across the bottom of the screen. "Billion-dollar hotel acquisition collapses during board meeting. Hidden heir takes control." Within minutes, reporters began replaying the restaurant footage alongside the breaking news. Millions of people who had never heard my name were now watching the moment Victoria poured wine over my uniform. Social media exploded, with comments from current and former hotel employees sharing stories of being ignored, insulted, or dismissed by wealthy guests who believed their money gave them permission to treat workers however they pleased. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of talking about the inheritance, people focused on something else. They focused on the fact that I never answered cruelty with cruelty. Thousands of comments praised the quiet waitress, who remained respectful even after being publicly humiliated. I never wanted public attention, but seeing those messages reminded me that dignity often speaks louder than anger ever could. As I stood there absorbing everything that had happened, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a soft voice introduced herself as Hannah Collins, one of the housekeepers at a Sterling Grand property in Denver. She apologized for calling without permission before saying something I will never forget. "Miss Sterling, I know we've never met, but everyone here just heard the news. We've spent years wondering if anyone at the top cared about people like us. Today, for the first time in a long time, there's hope in this building. I just wanted to say thank you." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there, staring at my phone, realizing that my grandmother had been right all along. Owning this company was never the real inheritance. The real inheritance was earning the trust of the people who called it home. Just as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, James received another message. He read it silently before looking at me with a serious expression. "Audrey," he said, "it seems the Harringtons aren't leaving quietly." He handed me the phone. According to the report, Charles Harrington had just instructed his legal team to file an emergency lawsuit challenging the validity of the Sterling family trust. At the same time, Victoria had gone live on national television, claiming the entire board meeting had been manipulated and that she had been the victim of an elaborate fraud. I looked back at the closed boardroom doors and took a slow breath. I had hoped the hardest part was behind me. Instead, I was beginning to realize that inheriting my grandmother's legacy was only the beginning of the fight to protect it. I wasn't surprised that Charles and Victoria refused to accept what had happened, People who spend their entire lives believing money can solve every problem often struggle to accept the one thing it cannot buy: consequences. James looked at me, waiting for instructions, while several members of the board immediately began discussing emergency legal responses. I quietly listened before raising my hand. "Let's hear them out first," I said. A few directors looked at me with concern, but Williams smiled. He knew exactly what I was doing. If Charles Harrington wanted one last opportunity to defend himself, I was willing to give it to him. Not because he deserved it, but because I wanted everyone to witness the difference between confidence built on integrity and confidence built on entitlement. Less than an hour later, Charles and Victoria returned to the boardroom with their attorneys. The arrogance they had carried into the first meeting was gone. Charles spoke first. "Audrey, emotions have taken over today. We all said things we probably regret. Let's put this behind us. My company is prepared to increase our offer by another $300 million. I almost smiled. Just days earlier, he believed I wasn't worthy of serving his lunch. Now he believed I could be persuaded with a larger check. "Mr. Harrington," I replied calmly, "this company has never been for sale." "You simply assumed it was," his attorney interrupted, insisting that the trust could be challenged in court. James immediately placed the original trust documents on the table, along with decades of legal opinions, federal filings, and notarized records confirming every requirement had been fulfilled exactly as Audrey Sterling intended. Charles's attorney read through several pages before quietly closing the folder. Without saying a word, he leaned toward his client and whispered something that caused the color to drain from Charles's face. Victoria wasn't ready to give up. She stepped forward and tried a different approach. "Audrey, people make mistakes. Surely you don't intend to destroy everything we've built over one unfortunate evening in a restaurant." I looked directly at her before answering. "This has nothing to do with one evening. If it had only happened to me, I might have walked away, but it didn't." I opened another folder containing statements from employees across hotels the Harringtons had acquired over the years. Housekeepers, front desk clerks, servers, maintenance workers, and managers had all described the same pattern of intimidation, humiliation, and fear. "The night you poured wine on my uniform wasn't unusual," I continued. "It was simply the first time someone with the power to stop you happened to be standing on the receiving end." The room fell silent once again. Charles slowly removed his glasses and looked around the boardroom. For the first time since I met him, he seemed exhausted rather than angry. He realized there was no deal to negotiate and no argument left to make. One by one, the investors who had supported his acquisition stood and quietly walked out of the room. Within minutes, the project he had spent years pursuing no longer existed. As he gathered his papers, he stopped beside me. "Tell me one thing," he said quietly. "When did you know who you really were?" I looked at him and answered honestly. 2 days ago." He stared at me for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "Then I suppose we both underestimated you." I smiled gently. "No, Mr. Harrington. You underestimated every person you've ever believed was beneath you." Charles lowered his head without another word and walked toward the door. Victoria followed several steps behind, but just before leaving, she turned back to face me. I expected another insult, another attempt to defend herself, or one final accusation. Instead, she looked around the boardroom, then quietly asked, "If I had treated you differently that night, would any of this have changed?" I thought about the question carefully because it deserved an honest answer. "No," I said. "I would still have become the owner today. The only difference is that you would have left this room with your dignity instead of your regret." She stood perfectly still for a few seconds before walking away without saying another word. As the doors closed behind them, I realized the chapter my grandmother had spent decades protecting had finally come to an end. The next chapter, mine, was just beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Every newspaper wanted an interview. Television networks asked me to tell my story. Business magazines called me the newest face of American hospitality. I politely declined almost every request. I hadn't accepted my grandmother's legacy to become famous. I accepted it because thousands of people depended on this company for their livelihoods, and they deserved an owner who spent more time listening than posing for photographs. My first decision was simple. Instead of holding meetings inside executive boardrooms, I traveled to our hotels across the country. I spoke with housekeepers who had worked for Sterling Grand for more than 30 years. I had breakfast with maintenance teams who knew every hallway better than any executive ever could. I sat beside receptionists, bell attendants, servers, chefs, and laundry staff, asking them the same question wherever I went. If this were your company, what would you change? For the first time in years, people felt their voices mattered. Many of their ideas had nothing to do with profits. They talked about respect, opportunity, training, and creating workplaces where people were proud to stay instead of desperate to leave. Those conversations shaped the future of Sterling Grand far more than any consultant's report ever could. Within 6 months, employee turnover had fallen to its lowest level in company history. Guest satisfaction reached record highs. Hotels that investors once called underperforming began exceeding expectations, not because we cut costs, but because employees who felt respected naturally gave guests a better experience. As the company grew, I established the Eleanor Sterling Scholarship, helping hospitality students who could not afford college and creating emergency assistance funds for employees facing difficult times. Every major decision I made carried one simple question. Would my grandmother be proud of this? Whenever the answer was yes, I knew I was moving in the right direction. Wealth had entered my life almost overnight, but I quickly discovered that the greatest reward wasn't the company itself. It was watching people smile because they finally believed someone at the top genuinely cared about them. Several months later, I returned to the Grand Crescent Hotel without announcing my visit. I wasn't wearing an expensive designer suit or arriving with photographers. I walked through the front doors wearing a simple dress and took a seat in the same dining room where everything had changed. The restaurant was busy, just as it had been that unforgettable evening. A young waitress approached my table with a nervous smile. She apologized because another guest had been difficult, and she worried my order might take longer than expected. I smiled and told her there was no need to apologize. She thanked me before hurrying away to continue serving her other tables. As I watched her move through the dining room, I saw a younger version of myself, hardworking, overlooked, and doing her best despite not knowing who might be watching. When she returned with my meal, I thanked her for her kindness, left a tip larger than the cost of the dinner itself, and slipped a handwritten note beneath the receipt. It simply read, "Never allow someone else's opinion to become the measure of your worth. The people who treat you with respect when they have nothing to gain are the people worth remembering." As I stood to leave, I paused beside the same corner where William Ashcroft had quietly watched me months earlier. I finally understood why he hadn't stepped in that night. He wasn't testing whether I could endure humiliation. He was confirming something my grandmother had believed all along, that character is revealed long before power ever arrives. Had I answered cruelty with cruelty, none of this would have happened. It wasn't the wine on my uniform that changed my life. It was the decision I made in the moments after it happened. Sometimes, the smallest choices become the biggest turning points. Looking back now, people often ask whether I regret what happened that evening. My answer always surprises them. No, I don't. Without that moment, I might never have discovered who I truly was or the responsibility waiting for me. Charles and Victoria Harrington believed they had the power to define my worth because they judged me by my uniform. They were wrong. A person's value is never determined by the job they do, the clothes they wear, or the title on their business card. It's determined by the choices they make when no one expects anything in return. My grandmother understood that truth long before I did. And because she did, thousands of families still have jobs they love. Guests continue experiencing the warmth that made Sterling Grand special. And I wake up every morning grateful that the greatest inheritance I received wasn't a hotel empire. It was the lesson that kindness, integrity, and humility will always outlast wealth built on pride. If this story reminded you that no act of kindness is ever wasted, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been judged because of your job, your appearance, or your circumstances, only to prove people wrong later? Share your story in the comments, because someone reading it may need that encouragement today. And if you enjoy stories about hidden identities, unforgettable betrayals, and justice that comes when it's least expected, don't forget to subscribe. You never know which ordinary person in our next story might be hiding an extraordinary secret.